Hi, and welcome to Tocqueville Talks. I'm Brent Nelson, co-host of the podcast and director of the Tocqueville Center at Furman University. I'm here with my co-host, as always, Beth Larive. You doing okay today, Beth?
I'm doing great.
Yeah.
But I'm excited to revisit this event that we had from last semester.
Yes. So last week, we replayed the interview with Lisbeth Huga, who is a professor at North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And this week, we are playing the interview with her husband, Gary Marks. Talk about an academic power couple. He is also a professor at Chapel Hill, and both of them spent half their time in Italy at the European University Institute at Florence. So these are world-renowned scholars, and we were very fortunate to have them at Furman to talk about Europe and America. Gary Marks is one of the giants in the field, and he has done a lot of work on things like multi-level governance, which is a very technical term. It just simply means that decisions are made at many different levels, especially in a federal system. And of course, Europe has tried to be a federal system.
Yeah, this was one of the more fascinating aspects, is that in the discussion that we had, he got into not just the history of the European Union, but also its connections and similarities and differences to the Articles of Confederation and the American experiment in federation. So he drew a compelling parallel between Europe's trajectory and America's early struggle to move from the Articles of Confederation to a functional federal system, noting that they have similarities but also differences. And one of the things that came through and really increased my understanding of what has been going on over in Europe with this union is that it really is the most ambitious political experiment on earth. It's an effort to build collective decision-making among nations with deep historical identities and long-standing rivalries in addition.
Great. So let's go directly to Beth's interview with Gary Marks.
I thought that it was really interesting that you started to go a little bit into the history of the EU with it's Jean Monnet, and I was wondering if you could start off just a little bit of elaboration on that. You spoke of last night his desire for European unity and how he influenced that, and maybe a Tocqueville connection.
Well, Jean Monnet, I mean, there's no registered founder of the European Union. But Jean Monnet is the person who was at the heart of the idea of the European Coal and Steel Community. And what that was, it was set up in 1951-52, came into being in 1952. It was a way of combining the core industries, steel and coal, the industries that were at the heart of industrialization, and the industries that were at the heart of war making. Everything had to, tanks, guns, everything was steel in the industrial world of the beginning of the interwar, of the post-war era. And Jean Monnet is a fascinating character because he never held elected office. He was a kind of person who operated behind the scenes. And he had a way of connecting with people and convincing them in a really kind of plausible way. He was a very low-key, very rational person who could connect with leaders. And actually, he was a person, I mean, it's just an interesting kind of facet of his character. He was sent over in World War II by Churchill to connect with Roosevelt and eventually to organize the supply of munitions and defense capabilities from the United States to the European theater. And one of the kind of jokes made about Monnet is that he would draft a message from Churchill to Roosevelt asking for, certain access, and then draft the response that Roosevelt would reply to Churchill. So that's the kind of man he was. And he was the perfect person. He was always an internationalist. And I think what Monnet was most keenly aware of was the inadequacy of national sovereignty. You see, if you wanted so many problems in Europe across national borders, you've got small countries that are really juxtaposed to each other. If you have, let's imagine that you have some kind of rule, some kind of legislation in Belgium for clean air. But you can't, it doesn't make any sense because the air that you're going to be breathing comes from the Ruhr in Germany. So you've got to kind of coordinate if you want to achieve anything that crosses borders. And that really was the impetus after World War II. And then there was the sense that France and Germany had been at each other's throats for literally hundreds of years. And that had to end, and there had to be some way in which Europeans could learn from history. Now, I know it's kind of crazy to think that people could actually learn from history. We're not very good at doing that. But, this was, World War II took place after World War I within a generation. And so, we didn't learn from World War I because the peace that was imposed on Germany was a pretty harsh peace. It facilitated, it didn't really lead to the rise of Nazism, but it facilitated Hitler's nationalistic arguments. And then after World War II, people like Monnet, and Monnet was critical among them, said, look, this way of tying Germany down, like we're trying to kind of tie down a Gulliver, and we're trying to tie this giant down with strings, is not going to work. We've actually got to create a situation in which Germany could become associated with other European countries in something overarching, because our problems are mostly cross-border. Let's see if we can start again. And it was a venture into the unknown, and I would call it the most important political experiment that is taking place on planet Earth. Because what you had in Europe, and what you still have in Europe, is deeply rooted national histories, deeply rooted cultures, deeply rooted institutions, and deeply rooted national identities. Mm-hmm. So is it possible to create a polity in which you're making collective decisions with all of that in mind? And so when yesterday I talked about, the complexity of the European Union, I mean, if you're going to do that, you have to have a whole set of rules in which national governments are going to feel assured that they're not going to get things that are unexpected down the line of policy. And yet you've got to create, you can't rest on the national veto. You can't have a situation in which 12 or 15 or even 27 national states each are able to have a veto and the blackmail potential. If I'm going to go along with this, you've got to give me something special. And so it really is an experiment in overcoming national sovereignty. And it's still in process. And if you were to ask me, what is the future, what are we going to see in 10 or 20 or 2 generations in time? I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether this is really going to work or not. What we do know is that the functional pressures, that the kind of the rational sense of creating a greater capacity for collective decision-making in Europe is very sharp. It's very real. And it's all the realer now that we're in a situation where geopolitics has risen up and where you've got these great powers, the United States, Russia, and China, which are really ruling the roost, and Europe has to respond to that.
So from the American perspective, one wants to make, I think, an analogy between the other great, possibly, political experiment, which is the American experiment, and the transition from the Articles of Confederation, which is a collection of sovereign states formed into an alliance, to a unified state with a central government and a federalist system. So some independence of the states retained, and the European Union, which is I'm tempted at least to make it kind of analogous. One of the interesting differences, just from what you were saying, is that the initial impetus seems to have come I don't know if primarily would be the right word, but largely from the internal conflicts between the nations. France and Germany, you mentioned, long time conflict. There were internal conflicts between the states that they were facing, but they were facing external drivers as well that was making them think that they would need some sort of greater unity. And so I was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on, like, to the American ear, somebody more familiar with the American tradition, what is this experiment towards unity that Europe is doing, and how might it be different from the American experiment?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think there really is there's a real parallel. Look, if you go into the Federalist Papers, you see exactly these arguments. Mm-hmm. That is, there really was a concern that the states could be at each other's throats, and there are examples of that. There were there were conflicts about state borders after the Confederation. And then if you read the Federalist Papers, it's really a set of arguments that is directly relevant to Europe today. The benefits of economies of scale and trying to create public goods across borders. Now, it's true, the states of the United States did have some separate identities. They had been in existence, some of them for well over 100 years, almost 200 years prior. So they had time to build up separate identities and interests. And it was a real struggle to actually create a meaningful federation in the United States. And it took, if you think about the development of the Supreme Court, we're really talking about a process that lasted, more than 100 years for the Supreme Court to really exercise its supremacy. And the Sherman Act and so much else besides, is an element of that. So one of the ways of thinking about this is that the European Union has actually had a relatively short history. We're talking about, if you go right back to the earliest point at which you could say the European Union was created, that would be in precisely 1951-52. Well, it's been 75 years or so, less. And so the parallel with the United States is quite interesting because it took a long time, and the Civil War, for the United States to, before the Civil War, people used to describe the United States in the plural. The United States are X, Y, and Z. And it was really, after the Civil War that the is came to be, the United States is. And so there was a great deal of, conflict that took place to really create a meaningful federal political system in the United States. So I think, it's in a way time has been compressed for Europe because, one, the stresses on Europe, the demands for some kind of coherence is greater today. And I think that is, the point of our lecture yesterday was to say, look, the functional pressures on Europe today are extremely intense. Mm-hmm. Internally, from a global perspective, you've got global warming and the response to that. And the European Union is actually able to summon some real collective will to reduce its carbon emissions and to have a system whereby it can actually do that effectively. And that's a real achievement of supranationalism. But in the areas of defence and defence procurement, the European Union is really at the starting block. Mm-hmm. And those are some of the toughest issues. Mm-hmm. So the rise of geopolitics, the way in which great powers are emerging and starting to really push their weight around, to say the least, that's really putting Europe in a very sharp position. Will it be able to respond to those pressures, and particularly to Russian the invasion of the Ukraine, and potentially the way in which Russia could start to exert pressures in the Baltic states, where there are large Russian minorities. And right now, because the Trump administration is really creating a great deal of uncertainty and honestly distrust in terms of its real willingness to take up NATO and the commitments that NATO involves, and the questioning of those commitments on the part of the administration, Europe is in a pretty hard place. And I think there are real, the challenge of creating federalism is very acute in Europe today.
So I guess just for a last question, I'm very fascinated by your description of the contrasts between the American Constitution and the European Constitution, and the massively more complex Constitution that the Europeans have, which is, I'm sure, largely just due to the differences that they're dealing with, different nations with entirely different languages that go far beyond what maybe the American states were dealing with, or maybe not. But so where do you see, at the American founding, we know, in retrospect, what was aimed towards ultimately was a constitutional republic, the separation of powers, the preservation of individual rights with the addition of the Bill of Rights to the initial drafting of the Constitution being added in. And then Tocqueville can help us see to what degree America still would be considered to be a kind of constitutional republic that has successfully balanced liberty and equality and privacy and public demands and all these things. But where do you see Europe? What kind of a government is it?
Look, we don't have the words for it. Lisbeth Hoge and I came up with this term multi-level governance, which tries to kind of escape this dichotomy between a central unitary state and a true federal state. So it's going to be some mix of things. It's going to be a mix of what we describe as intergovernmentalism. That's, the rule by the national states, for the national states, in which they have vetoes, and something that is going to be more kind of federal in character, like the European Parliament. This is a directly elected legislature across Europe in which the member states, the national states, have no role at all. These are directly elected representatives. And when you go into the European Parliament, you don't see national divisions as much as you see the political divisions, the ideological divisions that you'd find in any national parliament. And so that really, the European Parliament really looks like, it's kind of like a smorgasbord. There are a lot of different elements there. It's in a proportional representation, electoral system. So a lot of different parties, political parties, can get representation there. They create European level parties where you've got, different representatives from different countries joining together into fractions. They're called fractions, which are just like quite coherent political parties. They tend to vote together. And then you've got the European Commission, which is an executive, which actually has the kind of the European interest at heart and not the individual national interests. There is actually a commitment that they make, a legal commitment they make to the European interest, and it's real. And then you've got the European Court of Justice. And when I tell my students, look, the European Court of Justice actually can fine and does fine member states when they do not put into action European legislation. And European legislation actually takes precedence over national legislation. So there's a very clear doctrine, supremacy and direct effect, which were established in the 1970s. You see, there's a real supranational element, but it's kind of like a journey to no known destination. Eventually, you might say, well, could it become a federal state? So much would have to happen. So it's going to have this combination quality. And as you mentioned at the beginning of your question, what you have then is a very complicated political system. And I mentioned last night that constitution runs to about 200,000 words, the most complex, the longest constitution of any polity on earth. And that really, one has to say, well, that's a reflection of the real constraints that the European Union operates under. But I do detect a growing consensus in the direction of more effective governance, which means more supranationalism. Because you simply can't have a situation in which 27 member state representatives sit around the table where each one of them can exert a veto. So it's a gradual process, and I think it's fair to say that it does have a direction. And it has a direction. If you wanted to put, a single recognizable word it would be to federalism. But if you say federalism to many Europeans, particularly those who vote for the hard right political parties, they would, respond in shock. We don't want federalism. We still want our national control that we wish to exert. So it's one of those, it's very difficult to describe the European Union with the terms that we use to describe national states, because the diversity is so much greater in the European Union than in any existent national states.
That was extremely illuminating. Thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Well, it's interesting to talk about Europe and its founding in the same year that we're talking about America and its founding. There are clear differences, but it's interesting that other places have tried to engage in this federal experiment. Well, if you're interested in hearing more of Gary Marks and Lisbeth Huga and others in the Europe and America conversations that we had in November, go to our website. You can get to it by Googling Tocqueville Center at Furman, and you'll see past lectures and student blogs and all those good things that give you an idea of what we're doing here at the center. And also, be sure to follow this podcast. So for now, goodbye.